Welcome back. This is part 2 of the video series Photo Backdrops Made Easy. Now in part 1 we sort of ate dessert first and jumped into the process of creating a photo backdrop as soon as we had some of the preliminaries in place. In this part we have to go back and eat our vegetables and discuss how to take photographs, and then finally how to print the photo mural, the photo backdrop, so that you have the complete process. So let's get started. Taking photos. It should probably go without saying that what you need to do is seek out vistas where you have a large expanse of scenery and sky. Now if you're taking industrial scenery, you may not be able to get that. You may have to take a lot of individual pictures of industrial structures, and then piecing them together is going to be more difficult. But let's assume that you're taking scenery, mountains, desert, whatever it happens to be, whatever your scenery for your model railroad is. Try and find a vista where you can get maybe 100 degrees of scenery in. You're not going to get 180, you shouldn't even try, but you also don't want a very, very narrow scene either, because that's not going to produce a very satisfactory backdrop. A general recommendation for photography holds for our backdrop photography as well. Try and photograph between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. when you have relatively flat overhead light. And the reason for this is to minimize the effect of shadows. If you have very long shadows, very strong shadows, either facing the east or the west, it gives a specific time of day to your photograph that the rest of your layout lighting should have to match. If, however, you photograph at midday sun when it's overhead and the shadows are minimal and falling directly below objects, that will match most layout lightings which have overhead light on them. Use the panorama or scene mode if it's available on your camera. Now, I use Canon cameras, and they have a scene mode where you start the scene mode, take one picture, it's displayed in a small section of the screen, and the next picture, or what you're seeing through the lens, is displayed so that you can line up the two shots before you even take the shot. Now, that's probably pretty unique amongst cameras, but a lot of cameras do have a panoramic or scene mode, and if your camera does have that, learn to use it because it will probably be helpful. Another tip is to use a tripod if you have one available to you. The tripod serves many functions, the most obvious of which is it prevents your hand from shaking when you're taking pictures. And that's okay, but more importantly, it makes sure that as you pan each picture from left to right, that your vertical and horizontal alignment of the shots will be much more consistent than if you tried to handheld. Now, you can handhold and take perfectly adequate photo backdrop photographs, but a tripod will just make it more reliable and easier for you to do so. So when you have it on the tripod, pan, take your leftmost shot and pan left to right as you take shot after shot after shot. Next is overlap each photograph by at least 20%. Now, some online tutorials about shooting panoramic photos will say 30% or even more. I think 20% is about a minimum. If you overlap 20% or more, you're giving the photo stitching software more overlap area to work with so that it can move those photos around and get a better match than if you have only a 5 or 10% overlap. That doesn't give the photo stitching software, which after all, remember, is not as intelligent as a human being, much to work with. So try 20%, 30%. After all, it's only electrons and space on your memory card. It's not like you're wasting real film as you did in the old days. While we're talking about it's only electrons, bracket your exposures. Now, by this I do not mean bracket from shot to shot to shot. Set up one setting on your camera, even if that's the automatic setting, then take all of your shots, then go back and take another series of shots with a different exposure setting. This will give you some options to look at the different series of panoramic photos and pick the one that you like best. So bracket your exposures. Again, it's only electrons and space on your memory card. Now I'd like to talk about some photographic tips for how you should compose and take your photographs. First one is when you take a photograph of a vista, so you have a clear vista, you've got 90 to 100, 110, 20 degrees of horizon that you can see. Get a few feet up before you take the picture. You don't want to be standing at ground level when you take the picture. And the reason for this is that you will get all of the ground clutter in your picture. Now, I'm not talking about getting on top of the nearby hill. I'm talking about 20, 30 feet, if you can at all manage it, so that if there are cars and other things in the foreground, you can shoot over those cars and they don't appear in your picture. If you can't accomplish this, well, that's okay. You can either take those out of the picture later or crop them out before you stitch the picture together. However, it's better not to have them there in the first place, and that will save you some work. Here's an example. This is a photo mural that I've stitched together out of several exposures that I've taken. Now, I've done nothing more than stitch the photos together. I haven't done any cropping or color correction or anything else because I wanted to show you what the raw photo looks like. It's not a bad photograph for use as a photo background. We have this farmhouse on the left with a silo that we'd like to preserve because it's pushed sufficiently far in the background that it'll look nice blended in with the foreground scenery and trains. However, over here on the right we have several buses and SUVs that we would rather not have there. We can get rid of them, we can clone tool them out, we can somehow get rid of those, but it's going to be a lot of extra work. The pole fits in that category as well. In the left center here we have another trailer SUV, which its roof is just sticking out. This will be a much smaller job to get rid of it, but again, if I had been able to get a few more feet of elevation, these items wouldn't appear in the photograph and the work we would have to do would be much reduced. The next tip is to have your camera set for as near a normal lens perspective as you can make it. You want it to be neither wide angle nor telephoto if you can at all swing it. This would be the equivalent of having a 50mm lens on the 35mm camera. That's considered normal perspective. The reason for this is either telephoto or wide angle will distort what you expect to see in the picture, what you would see with your unaided eye. The wide angle lens will distort things in the foreground, and the telephoto lens will foreshorten things in the foreground. Either way, you're not going to see what you expect to see in the final picture. In addition, either telephoto or wide angle will make the stitching function of your software a little bit more difficult. The problem is, however, that most cameras today, whether they're point and shoot or the prosumer cameras, don't tell you what the equivalent focal length of the lens setting is. It'll tell you whether it's to the wide angle side or to the telephoto side, but it doesn't give you a number that you can guide by. So the advice is don't set it for either extreme wide angle or extreme telephoto, and try and compose your shots, including the zoom setting on your camera, so that it looks normal to your unaided eye. This next picture illustrates both photo taking tips we've just been talking about. When I took this picture, I was able to get up on the side hill, on the embankment on the other side of the road, and take the picture. So had there been any cars here to obstruct my view, I would have been able to shoot over them. Another thing getting up a few feet does, it brings more of the foreground into the picture than you can see from ground level. However, for all the good that I didn't set my camera for normal lens setting, and I took this one with a wide angle setting, and you can see the result in the foreground. See the result of the wide angle lens setting in the foreground of this picture. For one thing, the road, which should have been more or less straight in this location, now is bent into a curve, and that's the result of the wide angle lens. And that effect is throughout the whole foreground. As you look at the foreground, the grass on the other side of the road, you get the queasy feeling that something isn't right. You know that some of these lines should be straight and not everything should have this uniform curve through it. So that's the first effect of a wide angle lens. This curvature effect diminishes more and more as we look further into the background. As we look at the tree line in the distance and then the mountain tops beyond that, we can barely detect that there's any distortion. But if we were to take this picture and crop out the entire foreground just to leave the trees and the mountains, it probably would not make a very satisfactory photo backdrop. So always try and get your camera set to normal setting so that you can use as much of the picture as you've taken. Next effects of the wide angle lens you can see here. Each wide angle photograph in effect has a slight barrel shape, and when you go to the stitching software it's going to have a harder time fitting those barrel shapes together. Now this particular picture is not an extreme example, but you can see here in the edge of the road that the stitching software wasn't able to make everything line up. Again, this isn't a very extreme example of that, but you can have very extreme examples where the mismatch is so great that you can see it very readily in the scenery. So that's another reason for not going to extreme wide angle. Here's another example of how wide angle settings can mess you up. I saw this bright blue brassy sky like none I had ever seen while I was driving into town. I went back home, got my camera, rushed back to the spot, and I was standing by the side of the road hurriedly trying to get a series of shots in before someone came along the road and cut me down. Although the intention in this series of pictures was to get the sky and not anything in the foreground or at the horizon, there's still enough distortion caused by the wide-angle lens to the clouds and to the sky that I've never actually been able to use this photograph, even though I would desperately like to. The clouds are distorted in such a way that I believe if I printed this out and hung it above my layout somewhere, the unnatural perspective caused by the wide-angle lens would come through loud and clear. By the way, all of the shots taken in both of these videos, taken by me, that would be everything except the pictures we downloaded from CG Textures, was taken by me without a tripod. So it's entirely possible to take photo backdrop shots without a tripod successfully. Now let's talk about printing your photo backdrop. In part 1 of this video series, we illustrate how to prepare your photos, including stitching, color correcting, resizing, etc. We also touched on the fact that, in my experience at least, using plain paper and ink for printing is okay. We want our backdrop to be a little soft, that is, not sharp, so that it does not detract from the terrain, structures, and scenery in the foreground. Plain paper and inks, instead of photographic paper and inks, contributes to a softer image. You may want your razor-sharp background, in which case you should be looking at a prints made on photo paper. Where can you get your backdrop printed? Your workplace or university may have a large format printer available, like the HP DesignJet series. They are becoming quite common in many places. If you can obtain permission to use one of these, you'll undoubtedly have the easiest and least expensive method to make prints or reprints should you have to make a second attempt. Please don't use your work or school printer without first obtaining the proper permissions. Your model railroad is not worth getting fired or expelled over. Another option is Walmart. Walmart's photo department can do 20 by 30 inch prints, either from photos that you submit online or from CDs or memory cards that you bring into the store. As of the making of this video, the cost of a 20 by 30 print is $18.86. Some individual Walmart stores also offer a 24 by 36 inch size print for $20.86. However, not all stores offer this size, and it is not, as of this recording, offered online. When you have these prints made at Walmart, be sure to select the borderless printing option. Using the 20 by 30 in portrait mode, you can make a 30 inch high by any arbitrary length backdrop out of several prints butted together. If you only need a 20 inch high backdrop, then set up the 20 by 30 print in landscape orientation. The process of creating the individual prints is called tiling. You may remember that term from part 1 where we used tiles that we obtained from cgtextures.com. Some graphic software will automatically tile a large print for you as part of the printing dialog. However, they generally limit the size of each individual tile to one of the sizes handled by any printer attached to your computer. Since Walmart's printer is not attached to your computer, you have to use another technique to make the tiles. Here's a demonstration of how to make your tiles. I've opened the sky backdrop that we created in the first video here in GIMP. If you remember, this backdrop was 24 inches by 72 inches. So just to make life simple, let's assume that a Walmart near you offers the 24 by 36 inch prints. That means that we can print this backdrop in just 2 tiles. Choose the rectangular selection tool up here. It's the upper leftmost icon on the toolbar where you see my cursor. Then go to the upper left of the picture of the backdrop and get that aligned as best you can and start to pull down and to the right till you're down to about the bottom and about halfway across the picture. We're going to make an adjustment on that right now. Down here on the toolbar, after you selected the rectangular select tool, this part of the toolbar changes into a dialog box associated with the rectangular select tool, and you'll see this entry here for size. It's currently in pixels and we want it in inches, so we're going to pull the selection box down and choose inches. Now in the box on the left, it gives the width of the selection rectangle we just drew. We're going to enter 36, and the right gives the height. We're going to enter 24 and then hit return. That will set the rectangular selection box at exactly 24 by 36 inches. Now we go to the edit menu, open it, and select copy. What that does, it copies the contents within that rectangular selection box to the clipboard. The next step is to open the file menu and select new. When the dialog box opens for the file menu, use the selection box here to select inches instead of pixels, and GIMP is saying it's going to open a 24 by 72 inch window for you, which is the size of the original file. But we don't need that. We need a 36 inch wide window, so we're going to enter 36 there for the width and hit enter. Now GIMP's saying that we're trying to create a very, very large file, which we are, but we're just going to click OK and let GIMP deal with it. It'll take GIMP a few seconds to open that window, probably a little bit faster than a little bit slower than it does on my machine here. And once that window is open, go into the window, go to the edit menu, open it, and select paste. That pastes the contents of the clipboard, what we just copied out of the original photograph, into this window. So now it's there. Now we need to save it. This is our first tile in effect. So we're going to go to the file menu. We're going to choose save as. A dialog box will open asking us for a name. So we're going to call it tile1.jpg. And that .jpeg is going to tell GIMP to save this as a JPEG file format. And then we click save. GIMP is going to complain here that JPEG can't handle transparency. That's a geeky graphics thing. We're just going to select export. Now it comes up with a quality dialog box. If you select very high quality, that's going to create a large file. If you select very low quality, that's going to create a small file. We probably don't need this all the way up to very high quality because we don't want our backdrop to be overly sharp. So let's probably select something around 60, 65 for quality level. This isn't too very important, but if we selected a very, very high quality, unless you're absolutely sure that whoever's going to print your photograph can handle it, it might give them trouble. And now we click save. It's taking a few seconds to save that. And now we've created our first tile. And that's basically all there is to creating a tile. So we're going to close this window because it's saved. Now if we want to create the second tile, we're going to go back to the original window, slide over to the right. We still have the rectangular selection tool chosen, and we're going to start at the upper right corner and pull down towards the center with our selection box till we're there, and then go through the setting of the exact size and everything that we did before. If you follow this procedure, you're going to have 2 tiles which will butt join together at the center after they're printed. Now, what happens if you want them to overlap a little bit at the center so that you can move them around to get an absolutely perfect match? In that case, when you start your second tile, don't start at the very upper left-hand corner. Start a little bit to the left of that, and again, pull it down and a little bit beyond the center line. and then use the adjustments to set it for 24 by 36. And what that will do will give you an overlap between the two, which is approximately the same distance that you moved in from the right hand corner here. We'll demonstrate that procedure of how to do that and the reasons for doing it in a subsequent advanced techniques video. Walmart's posters are printed on photo paper. You'll have to decide for yourself whether the prints produced by this process are too sharp or too soft. I probably should not be saying this, but Walmart's policy of taking back any print that you're not satisfied with, and I assume that this applies to large prints as well. Remember this process of producing tiles, as it will be useful whenever your printer is smaller than the backdrop you want to print. If you want to avoid all the rigmarole associated with multiple tiles, is there any place other than work or school where they might have large format printers? Staples actually offers an oversized prints up to 36 inches by 90 inches. A 24-inch by 36-inch print is $42.80 as of this taping, so it's more expensive than the Walmart option. However, you could get your backdrop printed out in one piece. You can submit your files for a quote online at the link I'm going to put up on the screen for you. At this same web address, you'll find Staples photo enlargements. The maximum size is again 24 by 36, and the price for this size print at Staples is $27.99. An additional piece of information about Staples photo prints is that they only offer portrait orientation. Keep this in mind as you're laying out your tiles, that you can't get the landscape orientation. Finally, Staples offers 2.5 foot by 6 foot and 2.5 foot by 8 foot vinyl banners for $54.99 and $69.99 respectively. I haven't used or seen these banners, but I suspect that they're not suitable for photo backdrops for a couple of reasons. First, the surface is likely to be textured as well as shiny. Shiny could be fixed with an overcoat, but there's not much you can do about the texture. Second, the maximum file size for these banners is 12 megabytes, which for a backdrop of this size is too small to get any reasonable level of detail. The small file size implies that these banners are intended for text messages with limited graphics. There are online sources for large photo prints. One that I've corresponded with but have not used yet is perfectposters.com. Perfect Posters makes photo prints from 16 by 20 for $8.89 to 40 by 72 for $83.33 and can go to 96 inches long with a 20% surcharge. They offer several choices in finish, glossy, satin, and matte, as well as different surface finishes for the paper. I would expect that a matte finish on plain surface would be the way to go. They claim that their paper is acid-free and archival and that they use archival inks, but I'd still overcoat the prints to protect them. These are photo prints, and Perfect Posters manipulates your files to get the sharpest print possible. If the file that you send them is sufficiently soft to begin with, your print should be okay. By the way, the max file size for Perfect Posters is 300 megabytes, which should be plenty. The least desirable printing option, but still a viable option, is to print the backdrop on a desktop printer attached to your computer. This isn't a bad option if you have a large format 11 by 17 or 13 by 19 printer. Most graphic software will automatically tile the print for you when it knows what printer is connected. You'll have to choose the landscape or portrait orientation. Make this choice to minimize the number of joints and to hide them within a busy part of the backdrop if possible. As I mentioned before, plain paper and inks are okay, however, color laser prints are not. Color laser prints are very indistinct and, in my experience, do not hold colors well across the page. Finally, color laser prints tend to be glossy. This hasn't been an exhaustive list of the ways and places where you can have your photo backdrop printed. There are other options which I haven't investigated yet, like the shrink wrap vinyl used on automobiles. Some of these methods may work and others may not. Use your imagination as you try and figure out how to get your backdrop printed. Regardless of where and how you have your print done, you should apply some form of overcoat to protect it. Inkjet inks aren't waterproof, and you'll likely be using this backdrop in close proximity to water-based scenery materials. The coating will help protect the backdrop. In addition, a good overcoat will also protect against the fading effects of UV light, and if your photo print was done on a glossy surface, application of a matte finish will tone it down. Use a matte artist fixative. Essentially what we're talking about is a dull coat for artists, and use it over the whole print. Use a coating designed for inkjet prints if possible. I've used Krylon's Artist Matte fixed from a spray can with good success, even though it's not inkjet specific. Well, that's about it for the basics. Let's recap the 5 steps to making a photo backdrop. First, take photos or obtain them online. Second, you have to take those photographs and stitch them together. Third, you have to compose, adjust the color, brightness, contrast, crop, do all the manipulation that you're going to do. Fourth, you need to resize. You need to change the resolution to be near or at the resolution of the printer you're going to print it on, and you have to change the physical size of the print to be the size you want it to be on your railroad. And then finally, after all that work, you print it. You can catch me with an extensive discussion of photo backdrops and some green screen video techniques, including some observations and tips on the Model Rail Radio podcast number 50. And I start the discussion at about 2 hours and 23 minutes into the podcast. You can get this episode at the link shown on your screen. Model Rail Radio is a great podcast with great wide-ranging content and participation that's open to everyone. There's probably going to be an episode 3 in this video series, which I'm calling Advanced Techniques, and it's in the works. In it, I'll demonstrate picture-taking techniques, sophisticated editing methods, and new photo manipulation tools. There will also be a demonstration of some desktop printing techniques that may be helpful to you. Advanced Techniques will likely be available on DVD only, and it's coming in the summer of 2012, so watch for it. Until then, thanks for watching.